go. All right, so welcome to this Right to Publish webinar on openings and conclusions. We're going to talk about introductions and, well, wrapping up and conclusions, and a few other things along the way. So just a couple reminders where we are in this semester. It's November 4th today, so tomorrow. If you want to take a break from the US election day, you can jump into the CSU Rights Book Club conversation. It's on the book called Optimal. Room 322 in the Laurie Student Center if you're here in person. And if you want, you can jump in on Zoom. Just let me just send us an email so that you can get that Zoom access. I want to give a shout out to Kelly Bradbury's little session. She's doing a panel conversation as part of the WAC week, Writing Across the Curriculum. And on Wednesday, November 6th from 1 to 2, she's got that panel running. It's Zoom, so it's virtual, so all of you can attend, no matter where you are. And it's about graduate students and writing across the curriculum. So if you're interested, please just email me and I'm happy to, or put it in the chat, and I'm happy to just pop in and put that Zoom link there. And then today's workshop, we're going to talk about a little bit about science of perfect timings. I'll bring in some Daniel Pink stuff. I like his book, When. Also, we'll talk about the nature of perfect timing, beginnings, middles, and ends, because we're talking about openings and conclusions, right? Story structures, we'll return to that from Joshua Schimmel. We'll talk specifically about openings, specifically about those conclusions, and talk about the Canvas course as well. And I agree, yes, that often like taking the stand in the end, we'll talk about that and how tricky that is in putting things together. So we had some conversation earlier. If you're doing the Canvas course, there's 3 questions, just 1 submission, should be pretty easy to do. Consider the following about your title, about your arguments, about searchable key terms. Does it include a verb? We'll talk about that. And then in your introduction itself, that opening, does it start with some sort of, and we talked about this briefly, but a gripping, and we're not going to say, like, it doesn't have to be flamboyant. It doesn't have to be, anything, but it has to be gripping. And that's going to be all within context of your work anyway. Does it set up who, what, when, where, why? And does it contain some sort of map or guidance for your readers with that? And the conclusion. And conclusions vary from field to field, journal to journal. So just note that in some fields, you would perhaps combine both your findings and your discussion and have them kind of work together. In some fields, they're separate. In some fields, your discussion is really your wrap, and it kind of may have like a paragraph or so at the end that talks about, next trends or things that people can build off of. For some people, your field will have something that's clearly a conclusion that is separate. Then you have your discussion, and then you have some sort of a broader statement. So it just depends. You want to make sure that no matter what your field and kind of what's common to your journals in your field, that you have a clear takeaway for your readers and from that study. Mentioned Daniel Pink's When. I love it. If you haven't read it, it's an easy read. It's talks about kind of beginnings, middles, and ends, not necessarily from a narrative perspective only, although he does bring in story, which is kind of my interest in it as well. But he talks about like what happens in the beginnings of things and how kind of that birth and that kind of waking up or that new renewal or that new opportunity. And beginnings are significant, right? He says now science of timing has shown that they're even more powerful than we suspected, that beginnings stay with us far longer than we know, and the effects linger to the end. So we know that just even in human development, thinking about our early stages, our early days, and how important those are for impacting us throughout our lives. So it may be health, issues. There may be any number of things, behavioral, emotional. There are any number of things that happen early stages with human development. But we also know that lingering to the end and how we start things can impact, and we can kind of see vestiges of it. And if you think about your articles, it's a great way to think about what you set up and then where it is that you go. And you don't want to be detouring, right? You want to have the effects linger to the end. So it's about focus. and connection. So we can make an argument that's both biological, but also narrative, for beginnings being important. So when we open an article, that opening, again, a new dawn, a new day, new beginning, super important. And there are certain things that you're going to be taking into account in that the elements of that opening. First, interestingly enough, is one that we often bypass because we're so caught up in like, what do we say about our topic, that we forget that the first thing that readers encounter is our title. And your title, we'll talk about the having verbs and other things that drive interest in your title. They will also drive the sense of your argument. And it may be, for those of you who hesitate in staking a claim or making an argument, that your title will actually help you from the very beginning to do that. It doesn't have to be a strong claim. It doesn't have to be rock solid or concrete in the way that we might be thinking about those arguments. It could be that they can be nuanced. And so you don't want to have hesitancy, but you want to be able to state clearly, what is this article about? What is my kind of approach, or what's the significance that's going to be taken away from this? And you can do that in a number of ways with your title and have it be engaging. Next, interestingly enough, and we talked about this early on in this course, the abstract, and how important that is for being able to give readers a summation or a sense of what's going on so they know the value of your work for their own conversation. And then we have introductions themselves, introductions to the articles. All of those should be in alignment. CSU Rates, by the way, has an award at the Graduate Student Showcase for written excellence. And how we do it is we look at titles, we look at abstracts, and then we have folks look at the poster presentations and connect to the oral. And so the judging all happens, by the way, top down, right from the title all the way through to determine how things are aligned. And those introductions have a lot going on. So this is why we kind of get focused on those first sentences that maybe include a point, or at least kind of broadly what the field or the topic is, relevant background. It could include, depending on your field, maybe not, your literature review, maybe not, again, but definitely include some sort of significance, rationale, the importance for it. That what your topic is, your take or approach, and the significance, importance for the reader, for the field, all of those need to be within that first paragraph. You can also find ways to include a semblance of that within your title. And if you can do that for your reader, it's quite likely then you will have already been able to stake some sort of claim and garner their interest all at the same time. Readers who have an interest in your topic want to know what it is that you're thinking and how it is what you've done in your research, what you've accomplished. They'll be interested in your topic already. They don't need to know just the bland statement of your topic. They really want to know, like, what is it about? What's important here? Why should I be paying attention? And if you can get that in a few words within your title, golden. The story structure, though, is a version of who, what, when, where, why, and how within that opening. That's the O and the OCAR system that Joshua Schimmel talks about, with the opening, right, and the challenge and the action and the resolution. The opening, that introduction, it lays out who are all the characters. When is this happening? What's the context? Where is it happening? Why is this somehow significant or important? And then maybe how, particularly if you're writing a paper that's largely about the methods, that would be essential, but it might not be. Wendy Belcher reminds us that articles with strong titles, solid abstracts, and compelling introductions are more likely to be accepted for publication. They are more likely to be read, and they're more likely to be cited. So as a reminder, your goal out of writing for publication is not only to have your article published, but to have it cited. You want to be able to build your reputation and have an impact on your field through that writing. You can think about, like, how is it that you're going to grab people's attention as they're like cruising by, right, in that database, flying through article titles. What is it that's going to grab their attention? You might think that you have to be somehow clever and have a catchy title. We'll go through examples of titles and things that could be revised and how they might be based on Belcher's recommendations. But you don't actually have to be too catchy or esoteric. In fact, you probably don't want to be esoteric at all. You don't want to show how clever you are. You just want it to be engaging, and so that they know, a reader will know, I need to stop here. This is something I want to pay attention to. So what to do and what to avoid. Avoid the broad titles that would serve better for maybe a book or a series, something big topic where you could if you could write thousands of pages on your topic, you know that it's too broad as a title. Avoid strings of broad terms, right? So if you say, well, I can narrow it down by having a title, another, broad term connected to it, which might modify or make it a little clear, it doesn't really help that much. Yeah, that's yeah, having cool titles might make you sound clever in your dissertation too, but yep, tricky. Uh, you want to avoid naming all of the players, right? Then it becomes this kind of list of like all the subjects that you're going to be covering. It can be too much. So, and also too general, right? That your characters haven't been shown yet to your reader. So telling them about it in your title might be a little too much. What you do want to do though is suggest your arguments, right? So you want to be able to give some sort of sense of what your topic is about and then suggest your argument if possible. You don't want to be stringing along big, broad areas, but you do want to narrow it down so that readers can picture and understand what specifically are you going to be talking about this much larger area. What specific are you going to be addressing? You want to embed your title with searchable key terms. This is one of the ways that you can make sure that people stop on that kind of like database crawl through, that they're going to be able to grab it and catch your title. Avoid overly dense titles. You don't want to have things that are too complex. You want them to address your reader's interests and to be able to be understandable as and clear for them. And if they're overly dense, again, that's a version of, if you go with something that's super clever, then you might lose your audience. Same thing with overly dense. You might lose your audience. And as I mentioned before, include a verb if possible. So the subject and who or what that subject is about or doing. We'll talk about that more in a bit. And we've already mentioned this, but avoid that ego-centered or esoteric for your smart title. All right, so those broad titles. So we're going to go through each one of these on the avoid and what it's kind of recommended. So avoid those broad titles that would serve better for a book or series. And so this would be something like mitigating apprehension about Section 8. It's huge. And so what you could do for an article is pull it down to something very specific that you're talking about. So mitigating apprehension about Section 8 vouchers, the positive role of housing specialists in search and replacement. If you have something big and broad, apprehension about Section 8, first of all, it suggests that the breadth of that is going to be about folks who are within Section 8 or using Section 8. But here we have housing specialists. And so we know there's something very specific about housing specialists in relation to apprehension about Section 8 vouchers. So here's another draft, super broad. Tradition and the spread of AIDS in Malawi. So huge. This could be a whole book, right? If you can write 1,000 pages on a topic and kind of continually going through and talking about different areas and traditions and the disease itself, there's all kinds of areas where you would have to go into great detail to do a good job with a title like this. So much more geared towards a book or a series of articles. So something here, risky cultural practices associated with the spread of HIV or AIDS among pregnant women. So notice it gets much more narrow really quickly, right, in these districts. So it's in very specific districts. It's with a very specific population. It's with very specific cultural practices and with a very specific disease. So rather than talking that tradition and spread of AIDS, that's way too big. You want to go for something much more narrow. Those strings of broad terms, consciousness, controversy, and comedy. Again, if you just keep putting broad terms together, it doesn't make it that much more specific. Here's a question though. how Dave Chappelle made us think. Right, we've got something a little bit more narrow, but notice that first bit is just a string of broad terms. So now here's the revision. Squeezing racial stereotypes on Showtime television, right? The Dave Chappelle's conscious comedy. So we get a sense of like, what are we talking about? We're talking about racial stereotypes. We're talking about Showtime television. This is something that would be great for media studies, right? And we can get a sense of how it is that we're talking about comedy. Also note the made us think. It's catchy enough, but it's also super broad. And so we're talking about something that is conscious, that has an awareness, and that's about comedy. Naming your subjects, you want to be very specific here, right? You don't want to have it just be these kind of broad terms. So you don't want those characters to be too big. You want to be able to show your readers a little bit about who they are and what's going on. And so here, socially organized initiations, responses, and evaluations in an elementary school classroom. Who is doing what here, right? This is our draft. And so you can start off with drafts, and it has these elements, and we know that we want to be talking about something about organized initiations and responses and evaluations, and it has to do with school. But here we go. Now we have questions and answers rather than initiations and responses. Socially organized questions and answers. Student-teacher interaction in an elementary school science classroom. It's much more clear. We can understand. Notice that there's no verb here. You could actually take a stand and kind of have it be how student-teacher interaction or how socially organized questions and answers improve teaching in an elementary science classroom or something like that. So what do? They improve. This goes to suggesting your arguments. This one has no argument in it. Exposure to immigrant culture and dropping out of school among Asian and Latino youths. It's about exposure, and it's about dropping out, and it's about a certain population. So these are specific things we know, right? But we don't exactly know what that exposure to immigrant culture and dropping out is or means. So here we go. The benefits of biculturalism. Now we know that there's something beneficial. It's not necessarily a verb, right? It's not telling us the movement of the story, but it gives us a position on it, which is there's something that's beneficial that we're going to be talking about. Exposure to immigrant culture and school dropouts among Asian and Latino youth. Notice that if this is your area of study and you have read widely and broadly, the benefits of biculturalism, that title right there, it's going to give you the positionality of the author in terms of the topic, in terms of their research. You might not agree. You might automatically know, well, I don't know about biculturalism. Everything that I've read, I haven't seen the benefits. But it's also then a curiosity, right? It grabs your attention because of that. Embedding your title with searchable keywords. Here you're thinking about something like Black faculty salary differentials. And there's a revision, right? That's so broad. Salary differentials, Black faculty, those are faculty to searchable terms. Salary is a searchable term, but you're unlikely to get everything in there. So here we have Black professoriate explaining the salary gap, African American female faculty. That salary gap is going to grab that African American, the female, the faculty. All of those are going to grab Black as well. So there's going to be kind of a greater rate of you being able to connect with readers who are interested in this topic based on these searchable terms. By the way, if you're not clear on searchable terms, go to the library website or connect with a librarian. They're fabulous at being able to help you identify the searchable terms. And I recommend doing that before you submit to a journal. That way you have a clear title and you're not having to change it later on. And also because they will ask you for your searchable terms oftentimes. They'll say how many searchable terms, they'll give you like 5 options and you can put those in there. Here we have a draft of like a dense title, Degas, modistes, chic consumers, and fashionable commodities. All right. Who knows, by the way, what ultimately that means. Here we have a revision of it and it becomes much more clear. We're talking about fashionable consumption. We're talking about not just fashionable commodities, but we're talking about consuming fashion, right? Fashionable consumption, or what is fashionable in consumption. Women as consumers and clerks in the fresh impressionist paintings of Degas. So it's actually, sorry, it's not about fashion, but fashionable consumption, right? Fashions of the day. That including a verb, this can transform a title if you're having a difficult time and you're like, there's something off and I know it's boring, or I know that it's not doing the work that I want it to do. I want it to be much more engaging. I want it to draw our readers in. And you're like, well, I don't know, is there a verb? Just take a look around. This is a long title. It's The Process of Landscape Change, a comparative historical study of driving forces and neighborhoods in Norway. Okay, so we've got really specific key terms of what is going to be talked about in this paper. However, it's just kind of flat, right? And so a verb can change all of that. So why do landscapes change? We have do, right? Why do they change? A comparative historical study of driving forces in neighborhoods. And this was in Norway. That ego-centered or esoteric, kind of the previous you're smart titles. On the one hand, I think they can be clever and they're funny. However, you're probably not going to cite a paper based on its title, but you might look at it. And so we've had conversations with the USGS folks. One of them wrote about caffeine in urine that's been found in water in national parks or something like that. And so they had this clever title with caffeine or coffee and urine. And she said that it gets a lot of views. She says it doesn't get a lot of citations, but it gets a lot of views. So you can consider whether you want to run with something that's in this way. So shift happens, Spanish and English transmission between parents and their children. It's the shift happens is the playful part. But really what we're talking about, and here it's because the playfulness with the language gets in the way of understanding what the paper is about. So we're talking about Latino linguistic diversity and evidence for bilingualism in Spanish to English shift among Chicano children. All right, and this, I'm going to just refer back to some information that's a recall from our prior abstracts workshop, just so that we can get a sense of like when you move from the title to the abstract, kind of like how that works. And so you want to make sure that it's all aligned, right? That what you give folks as the abstract matches up with what it is that the title seems to be indicating. That will be helpful. And again, there could be a range of how much word space you get for that abstract. That summary abstract is mostly what you're going to be asked for, which will be a quick summary of your intro, your methods, your results, your discussion conclusion. If you're in an IMRAD structure, it may be a slightly different structure if you're in another field, kind of like mine, where anything goes for whatever reason in literary studies. But there are some tips. It helps, and we talked about this before, if you begin with your piece or a structured outline, something that's pretty complete on what it is that you're talking about in each section, so that you can describe it. What would be great is if you can have versions or variations of your section kind of topic sentences that could be pulled into your abstract. And so we showed that through the Killingsworth and Gilbert piece by just underlining all of the topic sentences, right, of those paragraphs and those sections, and pulling it together and shortening it and showing how that can create an abstract. Right? You get there by reverse outlining, which I just mentioned. And before you submit, just a reminder, just identify common patterns and kind of look through a lot of examples. This was that Brevia piece that we went through. Again, the Brevia piece is not an abstract, but it's a shortened piece, so it allows for us to kind of look through it. And what that shows us is that you can, in your abstract, take folks through your opening, your challenge, your action, and your resolution, all in that abstract. So they get a shortened, condensed story of what it is that you're telling. And as a reminder, in that Killingsworth and Gilbert piece, which we've been through about 3 or 4 times right now, excuse me, that opening, they set up, and we'll talk about this in a moment. We'll return to it. Mind wandering and emotional consequences. The challenge about how there's little known about those emotional consequences, right? Because there's been difficulties in gathering real-time data. So the action, and what they did is their methodology was crucial to that in developing a web app, and how they pinged people in order to determine whether their minds were wandering, excuse me. And then their three key findings were summed up as ultimately a human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. All right. So just a reminder in that first paragraph, this is how it was structured. And if we're going to talk about the storytelling structure, but in a different way, not just the OCAR for the whole piece, but what goes into that introduction as the who, what, when, where, why, and perhaps how, if we need it. We have the who right up front. We're talking about human beings, right? So broadly, human beings spend a lot of time thinking about what's not going on around them. The what is the not thinking about what's going on right here, right now, but stimulates independent thought or mind wandering, and it being the brain's default mode. Why do they need to study it? Because there seems to be some sort of emotional cost to mind wandering. We know in the past that philosophical and religious traditions, right? So we've got a little bit of context, when and where, to be here and now. And then these traditions suggest that a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. Are they right? And so we have this kind of combined, kind of bringing it all together in that final sentence, and then posing a question, which of course everything else after that will address and answer that question. Are they right that the traditions suggest that wandering mind is an unhappy mind? So I love that they bring everything together by kind of pulling it: traditions, wandering mind, unhappy mind. Question, is this right? All right. There's another way for us to think about it, and we've talked about this in the past. There's some context we're contemplating, some definition, more about the brain's default mode, some kind of suggestions, the happiness rate, that clear summation in one sentence, and as a question. But we can frame that, right? We can think about the who, the what. These are the characterizations of our work. Those first lines, when we talk about starting with a gripping first sentence, it can be super intimidating, right? We're like, what's going to grab our readers' attention about this particular topic, which I've spent so long on and I know so well that it's just now, how we talk about it, like boring, right? It needs to be covered in the most direct and kind of straightforward manner, super literal. We need to be accurate and precise. And there's no room then for kind of a lot of creativity for grabbing your reader's attention. And I think that gripping first sentence is really relevant to your topic and your argument. So your reader, this is where you have to trust your reader is going to be interested in your research and your topic in the same way that you are interested in your own research and topic. So you could think about writing like, what's going to grab my attention? I'm somebody who's knowledgeable in this field. I'm writing to other people who are knowledgeable in this field. What am I going to tell them about this topic that makes it specific to my work and that they will find engaging? What would I find engaging as well, right? This one's easy. It's super easy because Jean Kilburn, her work was on kind of big trends in media. And she looked at, first she started her career in looking at smoking campaigns and advertisements for smoking in the US, and talking about how they were structured. And then she looked at sex and portrayals of sex in advertising. So this is part of her career as well. And she had an article called Two Ways a Woman Can Get Hurt, Advertising and Violence. So if you're thinking about like, wow, two ways, there's violence that can hurt a woman, but advertising too, right? So that's even the title itself, right, grabs our attention. And that's because it connects advertising and violence and hurting women. But first sentence, though, is sex and advertising is more about disconnection and distance than connection and closeness. Wow. Makes you want to learn more. And particularly because advertising and violence, right? Connection, disconnection, distance, right? Closeness. So it brings together those elements already. Notice, and the point here is not that, anybody who has sex as their topic is likely to kind of pull a glance just because of the nature of the topic. But you can take the topic, advertising and violence and representations of women, and you can make that sentence or that first sentence really dull and boring. Or you can say, there's something to my field, right? There's just something in this study that's going to make it gripping. I'm going to work with that and be bold, and I'm just going to put it out there as that first sentence. So it might be, this is what I'm encouraging you to do, is even if you think, well, advertising and violin, representation, there's something that for you now has become very uh, field kind of straightforward or maybe systematic in how you're thinking about your topic. Go back and look at it, like what's gripping and what's going to bring your readers very specifically into the argument and the point that you're going to be making. And by the way, this point here, her first line, is also her main argument. So she has her thesis, she has her kind of gripping sentence, first sentence, and she has her topic sentence for that paragraph all in one. That first line, okay, also, I forgot to say, give them the who, what, when, where, why. Why if you need to. All right. First lines in that stating your argument and, if possible, your findings. Having it right up front is more helpful than having it buried. So here's an example. Young people with high academic ability who excel during their elementary and secondary school years are not necessarily guaranteed similar success in their university experiences, especially students who represent the first of their families to pursue higher education. So now we know, right, that there's an argument here about excelling and pursuing higher education and similar success. So they're not necessarily guaranteed similar success, right? And that kind of not necessarily guaranteed, that's an argument right there. It's the not necessarily guaranteed. People can work with that and say, oh, I don't know. I think I have different studies and different data. All right. So one of the things that you can do is identify your position in terms of prior research to start off study. Start up, you can say, this is my topic, and this is what is common in the field, commonly understood. This is where it is that I stand, right? You could articulate the significance of your subject. This topic is important because of X, Y, and Z, and then move into it. And you can also indicate the direction or give it some sort of roadmap of where it is that you're going to take your readers. These are not one or the other. You could use combinations or variations of these. And we've talked a little bit more about the flow in the past of how it is that you craft something that flows from one idea to the next, and that thematic unity. And so you'll figure out as you're moving through, kind of if you grab one approach and you're kind of like, I think I want to give them something of the significance or the import or why this is important right off the bat, grab their attention, then move into something else, then you'll figure out, is this familiar? Is this unfamiliar? How do you want to shape it and frame it thematically? And what's the logical flow? Some options for opening varies significantly for fields, so just note that. It may be that, and also project, by the way, it may be that for some projects or for some fields, having some sort of anecdotal opening where you start with what an interview subject has said, or you start with an example from your own experience, a related story, right? That's a great way to be able to pull people into all the significant pieces. You don't want stories to drag on too long. You don't want them to meander. You want them to be very specific. So the only things that are crucial to them understanding the big picture, the specific picture, the details of where it is that you're going should be brought into that anecdote. That subject of who or what your topic is, your study is about, something that's critical, that addresses a challenge to a prior standing or some sort of prior misconception in similar studies. You want to take care, if you do that you're not throwing people in the field under the bus, but it can be pretty gripping, right? We've commonly understood this. However, now, based on new work, this is what we understand. There's a version of that happened with the Killingsworth and Gilbert piece, right? That they say, well, this is what wisdom traditions have told us about mind wandering in the past. Are they right? So they don't really throw any particular religion or philosophy or kind of wisdom tradition under the bus, but they do pose a potential challenge, right? They're like, are they right? And it turns out, yeah, they are right. So they're not throwing anybody under the bus. They're just posing questions. The significance, definitely. Why your work is important has to be part of your introduction, but maybe you want to start with that. Like, what's so important that people need to know that impact that gap? It could be some sort of historical context, right? So not too sweeping, I remember getting asked, since the beginning of times, things change. It's not like that, but just some sort of sweeping something historical that is, people are like, oh yeah, that's interesting. And this was my faculty advisor's kind of key way of opening books, by the way, introductions to her entire book length project or to all of her articles, was to have her argument be her first sentence if she could. So kind of like um, Jean Kilburn's argument on, basically sex cells, that you want to have that be your persuasive point. Here's another example of a introduction that is probably more standard to the language that we talk about or read in our fields. Scholars in the fields of both sociology and political science have neglected the political importance of local feminist activists who organize in pursuit. So we have the topic, we have who, what, when, where, why. We also have that there's been something neglected. We have an argument already kind of keyed up, and then we have the specific argument underneath, which is, I argue that the confines of these disciplinary traditions have also affected feminist research. So it's a continuation of this, what she argues is been neglected political importance, the significance, right, to address this gap. And I begin by reviewing. So we also get a map and kind of a clarity where it is that this piece is going to be going after that. And then we get a very specific map after that, which is 1, 2, 3. In particular, I focus on, so it's a continual narrowing. Notice on this introduction of what, and it's one paragraph, right, of what the topic is. And she cues us all the way. Thanks, Ashley. So there are certain things to just avoid. And these are our last little tips, by the way. Dictionary definitions, they're just snooze-worthy. Nobody wants to, if they want to look up a term, they can go look up a term. If you're defining a term, define it within the context of how it is that you're describing the important elements or key idea. So just you build it in naturally so that people know how you're using a particular term. Avoid Wikipedia and those vast claims, right, for all time or in all cultures around the globe, because you can't prove those statements. They're not academic. So we want to start off broadly, and so if you have those in your, something like in all cultures or around the globe, just note that you'll want to edit that out. In the middle, we're just going to talk about one thing about the midpoint. Rarely does it follow our lives, do they follow a linear path? They're kind of these series of episodes of beginnings, middles, and ends. And we remember those beginnings, right? The first date with your spouse or partner. The endings also stand out, thinking about openings and conclusions, why those are important. The middles are muddy, Daniel Pink reminds us. And we use this as a model for a lot of our mid-semester retreats, right? Muddy middles. Things can kind of get lost in that muddy middle. But once you come back to the end, that beginning kind of resurfaces, like the reason why you set that goal and now it's concluding, or the reason why you had that dream and now it's coming true. The same thing then with the kind of the wrapping of our pieces. And yet at the same time, he does remind us that middles can be sparks, and they lead us to those conclusions. And that conclusion, again, it can be summed up. We talk about then what's the summary of our findings, what's our points. And for Killingsworth and Gilbert, it's really in conclusion, a human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And it's just that restatement, that clarification. And so for those of you who, when you get to the end point, feel like somehow this is the place where it becomes a little bit harder, you have to make sure that everything is clear for your reader for that takeaway, and that you'll have to take an ultimate stand, and maybe that's tricky. Just note that you've been taking that stand along the way. So if you've been building this for your reader, it shouldn't come as a surprise where you land or end up, that it should be pretty clear. All right. Excuse me. Always, tea in the afternoon does it to me. So a good conclusion, it summarizes your argument and that significance in a powerful way. It should restate ultimately the relevance in connection to scholarly literature and debate in some fashion. Again, that will vary depending on your article, your project, and the journal that you're publishing in your field. But there's going to be something that pulls it all together. And it can't introduce new arguments. That's for another paper, but you can hint, right, at future directions and new contexts. You make sure that you address anything in your discussion that you bring up in the introduction, highlight those novel contributions, and then just choose a structure. And if we haven't talked much about LDR, which is that lead, right, in development, and then the resolution for shorter pieces. But just note that you can state your key conclusions first and then support that idea. That's a kind of a newspaper or magazine structure more than an article structure for a journal. And so our takeaways, I'm just going to do a quick reminder of Canvas and then open it up. But now I hope it makes a little bit more sense on the 3 questions, like what's your title? And then what are you doing for your introduction, right? How is that structured? What does it do? And conclusion, like what is that doing? And ultimately, you don't have to have any of these written. You can anticipate, you can imagine what would it look like if you had that introduction and that conclusion and even that title. All right, so I'm going to stop recording and open it up for a little bit of conversation.